Hello and welcome to the final session of the Family History Show 2021. I'm joined by our experts who will be shortly giving their best tips and be able to help you with your questions. I'd just like to thank you all for joining us today and for helping us make this show another success. Firstly, let's introduce myself. I'm Mark Bailey and I develop web tools to help people break down their brick walls and find their ancestors. Now, let's jump and introduce our experts. Our first expert today is Nick Barrett, an author, historian, probably best known as being the lead researcher on Who Do You Think You Are on the BBC. Nick, would you like to introduce yourself, and do you have a tip that you'd like to share with our audience?
Thanks, Mark. My goodness, it seems years ago. And it was years ago when I worked on Who Do You Think You Are? And that was my first foray into genealogy. So I always feel a bit of a fraud, even though it's been 17 years. I'm a medieval historian by trade. A tip, well, never believe anything anyone tells you, I think is the thing I've learned most when researching people's family histories. But alongside that, look for all of those clues that you never think are going to be relevant. Keep coming back to them. The number of times I've gone back to my grandmother's photograph album, found new clues, new names, and it just unlocks a whole new branch of research. So, little bit of caution about what people tell you, but keep going back to those family clues. They're so full of information.
Great, thank you, Nick. Our next expert today is Jackie DePel. She's a family history tutor and a speaker. Jackie, could you tell us a bit about yourself, and have you got a tip you can share with our viewers?
Yeah, hi everybody. Well, I've been teaching family history for 20 some years now. It sounds even worse than Nick's. And of course, the Who Do You Think You Are programme catapulted that profile. So things I would suggest is always be receptive to the unexpected and not necessarily experts, but people who have experience. I think family historians, local historians, people that might give you a fresh take on your situation. So it's a great hobby and lots to learn, so enjoy it.
Great, thank you, Jackie. Our next speaker, we're welcoming back again military historian Chris Baker. Chris, have you got a tip you can share with our viewers, and we'd like to give a quick introduction?
Sure, Mark. Hello, everyone. I've been a full-time military historian for 13 years, but I was researching soldiers part-time as a hobby for about 10 or maybe 15 years before that, when I had a proper job. My advice to anyone trying to research a soldier, sailor, or airman is to be as flexible and lateral in your thinking as possible, particularly if you quickly find nothing. And the reason I say that is men and women were not obliged to give factual details about their name, their age, or where they lived, or anything like that when they joined up. And so you get all sorts of weird things, spelling variations, men using different names, completely falsified names in some cases. My own grandfather did that at one point for reasons that I still don't know. So if you get stuck, don't get discouraged. Just use a bit of lateral thinking and see and wildcards and all those other search tools that we've got available these days, and you might track someone down.
Thank you very much, Chris. That's a great tip. And last but not least, we have Debbie Kennett, an expert in DNA and surname research. Debbie, we'd like to introduce yourself, and have you got a tip you can share with us?
Yes, so I've actually been researching my family history for nearly 20 years now, and I was actually one of the early adopters of DNA testing, starting my first DNA project back in 2007. So it's been an interesting experience watching the market grow in all those years, and it's now suddenly exploded in the last 5 years or so, to the point where we now have over 40 million people who've taken a DNA test. So my tip is to be kind to your DNA matches, and bear in mind that a lot of the people who are now testing are not necessarily family historians. They are people who are testing for other reasons. They want to find out how much Scottish DNA, how much Irish DNA that they've got. So don't complain about your matches, don't judge them. The best thing you can do is actually to try and research their family tree for them and ask them gentle questions like, do you know the names of your grandparents? And you're much more likely to get a response than if you suddenly write to them and ask them, do you know anything about the Bloggs family from Yorkshire in the 1600s? Because they won't have got that far back in their research.
Great. Thank you very much, Debbie. Some great advice there. Okay, so let's get started with our questions then. Our first one today is from Mary, who asks, I've gone back as far as I can with parish records. Where do I go now and how do I get further back? Nick, have you got any ideas on this one?
I think a lot will depend on what she's found out already about her family. You can go further back, but it will depend on a little bit of luck, a certain amount of status within the family, and of course the survival of records where you can then pick up the names and get that verified link. Now there are sorts of records that you can work alongside when you're looking at parish material. If someone is of a certain rank or status, they might have left a will, and you can look for those in local diocesan courts, but it does depend on them having enough possessions to pass on to another member of the family, and so that's going to exclude quite a lot of people. You might want to think a little bit about where they were living. So this stops being family history and there's a huge amount of local history involved, because there are all sorts of records that show how people were tied to land and occupation. I'm thinking here particularly of manorial records. So very brief history lesson, 1066, normal conquest. William the Conqueror comes in and seizes all of the land and parcels it out to his supporters and so on and so forth. And the basic unit of local administration was a manor, where you have a lord and you have tenants holding land free of the customs or subject to the customs, and a manorial court really determines who gets that land. So that's a hugely generalised and simplified process, but all of these transactions generate records. So there's a strand there around land holding. But of course, these courts dealt with a whole range of other things as well. Misdemeanours, falling foul of local bylaws, and people encroaching on wasteland or common land. And so they're going to be full of names of our ancestors, living their lives, but occasionally falling foul of some of these jurisdictions and regulations. So it's not completely impossible, but you do need to think about the status, the unique naming patterns within the family, the survival of some of these administrative records, and possibly occupations, because then you might want to look at local guilds or town records where people would go to market and maybe trade or sell their possessions or goods. So you have to get into the mindset, bearing in mind parish records go back to the 16th century, of what life was like. Lack of transport. Yes, people moved around, but they didn't have trains. Again, it's about wealth and status. If you wanted to take turnpikes on coaching routes, you need to have money and purpose to do that. And a lot of people lived locally for long periods of their lives. So think local sources, and think local administration, and you've got a much better chance of finding people.
Great. Thank you very much, Nick. Our next question today is from Sandra, and she asks, in the early 1800s, I found marriages that take place 1 to 2 months before first child was born. How prevalent is this, and what were the usual arrangements made during this time for children born out of wedlock? Jackie, would you like to handle this one?
Right, okay. Well, maybe why get married when you don't need to? And can you provide a home? Can you provide income? Maybe you're not living together, you haven't got that facility. I would always get in touch with the locality and see what the local situation is, what normally happened in there. Was it an agricultural area? Again, something like that could greatly influence. Maybe have a look at what happens to the children. Well, maybe have a look in the church vestry. People might go into charity, etc. And workhouses could be a situation, but we're pre the workhouse, the union, so we are looking at local facilities to support people. Or people could be adopted, just taken in, maybe onto a farm, who don't have children and they want somebody else to help them. So again, I go look at the local trend, but I think it very often they might just have a reasonably a steady relationship, but don't actually marry till that child is on the way.
Great. Thank you very much, Jackie. Our next question is about DNA, and it comes from Helen. She asks, a lot of people seem to be taking DNA tests these days, but I find it very daunting as I don't understand how it can help me, and I don't understand the specific scientific terms. Are you able to explain in simple terms why DNA testing is helpful?
Okay, I will do my best. It is sometimes a very complicated subject, but I think what you need to do is to think about it as another genealogical record. And when we are doing family history research, we want to have access to as many records as possible. Now, DNA testing can help to confirm relationships, and I think one of the best uses of it is to actually take a test and to find that you match with your known cousins. And it's always best to work from the known to the unknown. I would recommend starting at Ancestry DNA. They have the largest database with over 20 million people, and it's the easiest to use interface. And you will find when you take a test, you'll get a match list with the names of people who are predicted to be your cousins. You may have first cousins or second cousins or third cousins in the database. And also it helps to do as much of your own family history research as possible before you start, and not just tracing your ancestral lines further back in time, but tracing all the descendants so that you know the names of your first cousins, your second cousins, your third cousins, so that when they appear in your match list, you will recognise those names. So the Ancestry DNA test is best used for finding matches with cousins within about the last 5 or 6 generations. It works best up to about the 4th cousin level. But also do be prepared for surprises, because some people do take a DNA test and they discover they don't match the people they expect to match. And sometimes they can find that long-coveted family tree is not actually their own genetic tree at all.
Some great advice there. Thank you very much, Debbie. Our next question is for Chris. It's from Janet, and she asks, where can I start looking for naval service records of the Napoleonic War? Chris, would you like to take
Thanks,
that?
Mark. That period predates the sorts of records that are now increasingly digitized. So we're into paper records mainly. And Royal Naval records of that period are rather complex. They're not one single document that takes you right down to the personal details of the man. Most of what still exists are actually connected with money. They are things like pension records and other types of recording of progress in career, which were usually to do with wages and the payment of pensions afterwards. So the sorts of records that are available are rather limited and rather fragmented. Almost everything worth looking for to begin to build up the man's story, regardless of whether he was an officer or a rating, are at the National Archives. Most of the collections are there. And the National Archives website has some very good, thorough and free research guides on how to work your way through naval records. It is a rather complex process. So, for example, if you are looking for an officer and you know his name, or you know the name of his ship or a particular period, you can search for him by name and by ship in the National Archives Discovery search engine for their catalogue. It will usually bring up the various records in which he has been named in the index of those records. But in most cases, that won't be true. The index will say it's a commission or warrant book or some such, and not name names. So I would take it right from the top, work through that free research guide, and expect to look at maybe 4 or 5 different types of record. And as usual with these things, every time you spot something, write down every detail and then try to construct a timeline. You won't come out of that and that particular period with a really rich detail of what the man did, but it should give you a good outline.
Great. Some great advice. Thank you very much, Chris. Now, the next question is for all of our experts, and it's one that many of us get asked regularly. What is the most surprising discovery you've made during your research over the years? Nick, perhaps you could start us off.
Oh my goodness, that's such a tough question, because I've researched so many people, and it's tempting to go straight to the who do you think you are answers and look for hidden links to the royal family. But often it's the more humble stories that make you sit up and take notice. I can't help, though, having done some research on this recently, to go to my own grandmother's story. She was illegitimate. We knew nothing about her, no birth record, not even the name of her parents. And over the last few months, if not weeks, we've managed to unpick that through some DNA. Debbie, I should have come to you much earlier. Various chance encounters with military records, because she was born just before the First World War, and a military project tracing Belgian refugees managed to track her birth record in Belgium, not the place we thought. But particularly looking at the father, the records took me in a direction I was very excited about, leaving aside the fact that he was a bigamist. He turned out to be a Mayflower descendant. So there we go. There's my Who Do You Think You Are badge of honour, until I did the DNA and then found out that he was not the father. Whole new bunch of names comes in, takes me into American ancestry again. The guy was a fantasist. He claimed to be a von Hotzendorf, a high-ranking Austrian family. He wasn't. In fact, he was another bigamist. Goodness, there's a lot in the family. Who also was an imposter and a criminal, got imprisoned in San Quentin jail for a few years. I mean, this left us absolutely flabbergasted. And there's something about it on your own doorstep, isn't there? You know, when you're researching for a client or for a program, you are excited by the research, you love the discoveries, but then it's someone else's problem. There you go, deal with it. That's yours now to own. When it's your own and you're having to process that, my goodness. So I've always been that arm's length genealogist doing other people's. Now I guess I really have got the bug, and that's why I'm sharing this story. It was absolutely shocking what we found out about him. And just when you think it couldn't get any worse, it certainly did. So it's a gift that keeps on giving, and a lovely story as well.
Yeah, lovely story. Yeah, thank you, Nick. How about you, Jackie?
Well, a lot of what Nick's just said, really. It's the excitement of it. And that 20 years on, and you're always learning. There's always something new, parallel lines with other people out of the family. My most surprising thing was to find I've got Cornish ancestry through my Royal Naval ancestor, which, you know, it's that story we've all got. They came from Hull. No, they didn't. They came from Hampshire. No, they didn't. They came from Cornwall. And that's where I think I'm likely to stop, unless I can find a record that says my son was press ganged in 17 whatever. I very much doubt that will happen. But it is really that excitement, that thrill, that learning. And because we learn history backwards way round, don't we, as family historians, it's personal. And the most exciting thing, my Royal Naval ancestor was educated at Greenwich. You know, those magnificent buildings by Cutty Sark. I look at those and I think he went to school there. So that's my gem at the moment. But there might be another one just round the corner. Who knows?
Great. Thank you very much. And Chris, I know researching military ancestors is bound to be your fair share of surprises there. Have you got any stories to share?
Oh, you're not kidding. I've studied over 10,000 individuals since I've been doing this. And it won't surprise you that some of them are incredibly surprising, either positively or negatively. I've had people that have come to me with a photograph of a man wearing a chest full of medals, none of which he earned. I've got families who, believe that their soldier was a very ordinary man indeed, and it turned out he had done some amazingly brave and gallant things and was highly decorated for it, for example. But the most surprising to me, rather like my colleagues before, is actually my own family. My maternal grandfather. He was a real problem, and I've been researching him for 30-something years, and I had a major, major problem. He died before I was born, but I know he was in the army in the First World War. I've got his medal, I've got a photograph. Good. But my mum always said he'd had a long period of time in the Navy. Went through the records, even in the days when you had to write away for these things. No, we've never heard of him. And I got absolutely stuck. I exhausted everything. And then about 5 or 6 years ago, a new form of army record was digitized and released. Militia. This is part-time soldiers, Victorian era. And I did a search using his name. No, nothing. First name, year of birth, place of birth, and up came a candidate that absolutely matched him. And luckily, some clerk had written on it that he had enlisted under a falsified name. And it led me straight away to the missing bit of the story. He'd actually been in the militia in the army, re-enlisted into the Royal Marines, hence my mum thinking he'd been in the Navy, and then went into the army in the Great War. It took an awfully long time, and that was a major surprise that he'd been in the Marines in the Boer War. Absolutely new.
Brilliant, yeah. Thank you, Chris. And Debbie, I'm sure with DNA, there's a lot of skeletons that can fall out cupboards. Do you have any stories that you can share with us?
Yes, there certainly are. Well, some of the big surprises, the biggest surprise that has come up is that we've had a number of cases now of babies who have been switched at birth by mistake in hospital. And I know of at least 4 such cases where that's happened, and I think there are many more, all in the US so far, but there's always a chance it could happen here as well. And if you want to read one of the particular cases, I recommend reading the book by Libby Copeland called The Lost Family, where she's been looking into one particular case. The other thing that we're finding is that a lot of people are making these discoveries through DNA testing that they are, for example, donor conceived. And what has been absolutely shocking is that so many of these fertility doctors in the past, they ended up substituting their own sperm for the father who was supposed to have been treated. And some of the families that have now come out of and now being discovered are absolutely huge. There are some people who are having to keep spreadsheets to keep a note of all of their siblings. And there are some sibling families where there's over 100 or even over 200 siblings in the network. But surprisingly, I've not had any surprise DNA discoveries in my own family. And my surprise, it all came from doing the traditional genealogy research. We discovered that my grandmother had 2 half siblings that we knew nothing about. I think my grandmother holds the record for or her parents hold the record for the closest shotgun marriage. I discovered that she was born the day after her parents married. On my maternal grandfather, it turned out that his stories were a pack of lies. I was always told that he was the product of a second marriage and that his 2 brothers were from the first marriage. I was puzzled why I could never ever find this marriage in the early days before we had all the indexes online. And then it transpired that he was actually born illegitimate. His 2 brothers were born illegitimate. They had the name Trask. He had the name Ratey. His parents were living as a married couple in 1901, and they married 22 years after my grandfather was born. And I only discovered the marriage at that time, searching through the indexes, looking for the records of his brothers rather than him. Of course, in those days, there was nothing easily indexed, and now I could find that instantaneously. So that has been a nightmare to trace. And even the grandfather was illegitimate. I can't find any record of the birth or the baptism. And I think he was living under a different name in the 1881 and 1891 census. And it's still a mystery to me. But now DNA is potentially providing the answers, and I've got this cluster of matches, which is leading me back to Oxfordshire rather than St Luke's in London, which is where my great-grandfather was born. So it's a continuous journey, I think. However long you've been researching, there are always questions and always things that still need to be answered.
Well, yeah, great. Thank you, Debbie. It sounds like DNA can be a tool to break down brick walls, but also open up a can of worms at the same time.
Most definitely.
Okay, our next question is from June, who needs some help with tracing relatives sent to Canada as British home children. And she's recently discovered 4 of her relatives were sent to Canada as British home children. She's tried to find out why, where and who they were sent to and by whom. Unfortunately, Barnardo's and the Children's Society have long waiting lists, which she's on. But is there anywhere else that she could look for further information? Jackie, perhaps you could shed some light on this.
Yeah, well, I've had a little look into some of this, and I would suggest she has a look at the National Archives website, there are some fantastic research guides, as have been mentioned earlier. And the one for this topic is children's homes. And that will start to give you some of the records held at the UK's National Archives. So things like Home Office records, local government board papers, Dominion Office records, Ministry of Health. Quite how much they will be relevant, useful, indexed, I'm not sure, but she could have a little look at that. I found that one of the National Archives specialists, a gentleman called Roger Kershaw, this is obviously one of his topics, and good, I'm getting the thumbs up from Nick.
Oh yeah, Roger would love that call out.
Yes, well, yeah. And if she would like to join the Guild of One Name Studies, if you look back to 2019, Roger did a presentation at a seminar on the history of child migration. Now that's recorded, but it's all behind the members' paywall, so I don't know whether approaching the Guild would get access for with that. But there is a book again by the same person, New Lives for Old, and fishing about on the internet there are 2 versions of that, and maybe you can get an inexpensive copy or perhaps borrow one from a library. And lastly, maybe have a read at the Children's Homes website by a very well-known person called Peter Higginbotham. He also does a workhouses website, and if you have a look at that, there is a lot more international material on those sites than I realised until I happened upon them. So I think, you know, that would be good whilst you wait for the traditional routes to come good.
Brilliant. Thank you for that insight, Jackie. This is another question for Nick, and it's from Linda, who's looking for advice on where to start researching her great-grandmother's birth. The only census record she has for her is in 1911, where she gives her birth details as at 1879 on the high seas. Her marriage certificate shows her father's occupation as sailor, deceased. Nick, is there any advice you'd give Linda here?
On the high seas suggests, you know, in my mind, the pirates on the high seas. Yeah. It's not that at all. This takes me back 25 years when I first started working at the Public Record Office, as it was once called, the National Archives today. And this was a line of question that would come up again and again. And I should also add, it would fill me with terror every time, because it's a very complex area once you start to unpick what the question is leading towards. Now, born on the high seas, that could lead to a couple of suppositions that you have to explore. Firstly, what sort of vessel was her great-grandmother's mother on, and who was she with? If she was a passenger, maybe that's one route you can have a look at. If she was perhaps the wife of a soldier or marine travelling around, that could be another route you could have a look at. Was she the wife of a crew member on one of these vessels? So there's sort of 3 routes you can have a look at. But there are some records that have been gathered together for us. Now, as Jackie has already mentioned, the National Archives is often the font of all wisdom, and they've created a series of research guides which look specifically at birth, marriages and deaths at sea. Now, the General Register Office has started to collate this information over its existence. A lot of the military records predate its existence, so there are some records from 1761, which obviously will cover this period. But the really important thing is that many maritime journeys had to record in the ship's log any births, marriages and deaths that took place on board that vessel. And the General Register Office would gather these together periodically. And you do find more of these collections appearing. Find My Past have some, but there's a fantastic register of maritime births from 1854, which the genealogist has put out as well. So you're going to find lots of these records available online, primarily covering the Board of Trade registers. Now, the Board of Trade was set up to regulate quite a lot of our maritime navy, crew lists and agreements, looking at certificates of competency for mates and for masters, and some of this detail as well. So you can find some of this information on the genealogist. Well worth searching, because their records cover 1854 to 1891, as long as this was a British registered ship. Now that will then lead you to a range of other clues, hopefully name of parents, and then maybe working out why she was on board that vessel. You might want to explore whether or not she was the daughter of a crew member. Now, there is the sort of a black hole for the records between 1858 and 1913. Regulation was less tight at that period. There were good records before and good records afterwards, but very little in between. But once you've worked out the name of the ship, you might want to see if there is a crew list or an agreement for everybody on board, and see whether your great-grandmother's father was listed and whether you can then follow his journey from that ship to the next and maybe piece together some of his career. So that would be my advice. Go to the research guides at the National Archives, explore the genealogist and have a look at some of those online records and registers. And then depending on what the circumstances tell you, you might want to look at merchant marines. Depending on what that information tells you, you might want to look at merchant navy records, possibly other sorts of passenger lists and journeys, bearing in mind that before 1890, you're not going to find a huge amount of information for many of those voyages, or possibly some of the military routes. So back into those research guides at the National Archives is probably the best place to start.
Thank you very much, Nick. Our next question is from Catherine, who's looking for her grandfather. She says, my grandfather was an engineer who worked with the Royal Engineers during the First World War. He was seconded to the Ministry of Shipping and moved from North Wales to live in London. As he did not see any active service, but was confined to a desk job, will there be any records for his army career? Chris, what advice would you give?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. In the case of almost every type of record, it wouldn't make any difference whether the man was serving at home or overseas, or the regiment he was in, or anything like that. The most significant difference would be that if he didn't go overseas, he would not appear in the rolls of the campaign medals for the Great War. So all of the other collections of records, yeah, he should be present if those records have survived. Service records, pension records, all that sort of stuff. And there are different formats of records, whether he's a commissioned officer or an ordinary man of the ranks. So it really shouldn't make too much difference. There is a possibility, though, that there is absolutely nothing left in terms of documentary record. It's a particular set of circumstances. Many people know that a large proportion of Great War Army service records were destroyed in an air raid fire in 1940. So if this man's record was destroyed and he didn't qualify for a disability pension and he didn't go overseas, so he's not in the campaign medal records, it is conceivable that there is absolutely no military documentation left. You may find him in the 1918 absent voters list for his home electoral area, for instance. But that tells you very, very little other than regiment and number and rank. It's an extreme case, but it's one I do come across from time to time. So aside from that, yeah, normal stuff.
Thank you very much, Chris. We have a question here from John, who would like to know about different DNA tests. He says, I've taken a DNA test with one website, but I'm concerned about uploading the results to other websites, as I don't want my private information scattered across the internet, as he puts it. Do I need to be worried, he asks. Debbie, what would you say?
Okay, so when you take a DNA test, all the companies have to follow the relevant data protection laws. And in actual fact, your DNA information in itself does not really contain any particularly sensitive information. Your raw data is not exposed to anyone. What you are sharing is your match list, and it's your network of relatives that is exposed when you take a DNA test. And the most sensitive information that we share, in fact, is probably not through DNA testing at all, but through if we're sharing information on, say, Facebook or just on mailing lists and all sorts of other things on the internet. Everyone is sharing huge amounts of information these days. And it's surprising how many, when I've been trying to track down DNA matches, how often I actually get the answers on Facebook, and you find that the whole family are all chipping in, and you find you can easily identify someone, and then you've got the aunts and uncles or siblings, and you can identify a whole family just through public posts on Facebook. I don't think you've got anything to worry about. You can, if you've tested at Family Tree DNA, you can upload to MyHeritage DNA and also to Living DNA. But if you do want to get into DNA testing, then you really need to be in the Ancestry DNA database, and they don't accept uploads. So you have to test with them direct. But always look at the terms and conditions of any testing company. One of the things that we have seen recently, which some people think is a good thing, other people don't think is a good thing, is that Family Tree DNA and also a third-party website called GEDmatch are now allowing law enforcement access to the database, so that law enforcement can upload DNA from a crime scene, and that is matched with either unidentified bodies or with potential perpetrators. And at Family Tree DNA, you can choose to opt in or opt out of law enforcement matching. At GEDmatch, you are automatically opted in to match with unidentified bodies. That's currently only happening in the US. And of course, it's a good thing if crimes can be solved that way. And it's something that is also being considered in the UK, and possibly a pilot study might take place in the UK. But there are all sorts of ethical implications involved, and particularly with the transnational transfer of data, and things like the death penalty is still used in America, which is not the case here. So really, my advice is to make sure you read the terms and conditions of all the different testing companies, but Ancestry DNA is still your best bet. And in fact, the largest companies, Ancestry DNA and 23andMe, are probably the ones that have the best privacy arrangements in place. And they also, both those companies, have their own dedicated privacy officers, and they are the ones that are trying the hardest to make sure that our data is protected. The smaller the company, the greater the risk. And if you're worried about any sort of privacy breaches, then it's likely to be the small independent third-party websites where those breaches are more likely to occur.
Yes, it seems that law enforcement and DNA is a bit of a controversial hot topic at the moment, Debbie.
It certainly is, yes. And it's something I've been very much involved in. And it's caused all sorts of splits and very polarised views, and trying to find a sort of happy medium between those is very difficult.
Indeed. On to our last question of the day. Ruth is asking, what advice would you give to somebody wishing to begin work as a professional researcher? Now, I'm sure all of our experts have advice on this, but let's start with what you would advise, Nick.
Probably to do the opposite of what I've done, which was just to get on with it 20 or so years ago and fall into the field. But obviously things have sharpened up since then, and I would recommend, I obviously would do, working for the Open University, to look at education, qualification and courses. There are some great courses out there, and I feel almost mean-spirited stealing Jackie's thunder talking about Pharos as one of those areas, because she'll probably come onto that as well. But there are others where you can get professional qualifications from the Institute of Heraldic and Genealogical Studies, a whole range of correspondence courses and diplomas, university-level courses, University of Strathclyde, for example. And these will help you gain recognition at some of the professional bodies that will promote researchers to members of the public, register of qualified genealogists, the Association of Genealogists and Researchers in Archives, AGRA. There's lots out there. But that's the qualifications route, and I'm sure my fellow panellists will share other tips as well.
Brilliant. Thank you, Nick. Debbie, what tips could you share?
Right, well, I'm probably not the best person to ask, because I sort of fell into this, and I just ended up, because I tested early on with DNA, I ended up being the person who understood it most, simply because I was just one step ahead of everyone else, because I'd already tested. And then I sort of explored all the new tests as they came along. But certainly for DNA, there are no professional qualifications, and in fact, that's something that is actually is making life rather difficult at the moment, especially now we've got all these people doing this work for law enforcement, and how do law enforcement decide which genetic genealogist to use? And there's just no way of any independent person assessing their abilities. But I'm a great believer in practice, and actually doing the research yourself, working on your own family tree, helping other people with their family trees. And I think by doing is the best way of learning. And perhaps on top of that now, I think the route is probably to do some sort of professional qualification to start getting into it. But don't think that just by doing a course for a year that you can automatically start out doing as a professional genealogist. I recommend doing your own research alongside that and getting the bug yourself so that you really understand how it all works.
Fantastic. Thank you, Debbie. Chris, being a military researcher, is there any specific advice you could give to anyone wanting to move into that field of work?
Yeah, perhaps a couple of things. First, you're not going to get rich doing military research. Second, if 20 years ago someone said to me, Chris, you're going to make a living doing this for 13 years, I would have thought them completely mad. It kind of came to me, and I'll tell you how, but there might be one or two aspects of this that could apply to others. I started doing this full time and asking money for it, having already built a reputation. A bit like what Debbie was just saying there, it came out of having done it a lot before. And that was partly through, I built my website, or started to build my website called A Long, Long Trail in the 90s. And people would come to me saying, Chris, this is great stuff about the British Army, but I want to know about my granddad. So I added a lot of content to make people go away, stop asking that question. This is how you do it. I mean, I was working for a living at the time, so please read these pages, you can do it. But this was also before records were digitized. So I still got people coming from Australia and Canada and what have you, who could not go to the archives. And at some point I must have cracked and said, I'll do that for you. And I started doing more and more of those. And so by the time I got to a point where I thought, actually, I could make enough out of this, probably, I'd probably already researched 500 or 1,000 men for people. And so my name was out there as someone who could do this stuff. So maybe there's no absolute parallel to that, but there is certainly something about the thing that says, you know, build a reputation and build up your own expertise first before you enter into this as a professional living, if you like.
That's great. Many thanks, Chris. Now, last but not least, Jackie, would you have any further advice?
Well, just the balance of experience and qualification. And coming, as I came into all this from a hobby and then doing an open university course, which is now defunct on family history and community history, you know, you do need that balance of don't just do the qualification and set yourself up as an expert, because you'll only fall flat on your face, really, and it doesn't work. There are lots of people, the ones Nick has mentioned, but there's also the WAA, the Family History Societies. Often they are doing little courses. They've got lots of enthusiasm. The Federation of Family History Societies. But get that blend of experience that Chris has said as well, and Debbie, you know, and that passion, because whether or not we make money out of it is secondary to our enthusiasm and enjoyment and helping people. Because whilst most people do family history just as a hobby, I have had people join my classes for some very serious issues of understanding why their lives has been like it is. So, you know, it's very important, it's very motivating, it's great. Enjoy it and get going with it.
Thanks for that. I think it's also worth pointing out there's a few societies and organisations that can help you here at the show today. For example, there's the Society of Genealogists. You've got the Association of Genealogists and Researchers in Archives, or AGRA. And we also have the University of Strathclyde attending. And you can find all of these organisations in the exhibitor hall, and they've all got people attending where you can ask on video chat or even just post a question in question feed, ask any tips and hints they may have for you. I think it's also worth pointing out, if you've got an interesting family history story, it might be worth writing that story up and sending it into one of the magazines. I know that the editor at Discover Your Ancestors magazine, Andrew Chapman, is attending in the exhibitor hall, as well as Sarah Williams, the editor for Who Do You Think You Are magazine. So it might be worth popping over to the exhibitor hall, looking them out and asking any tips they would have, and perhaps sending on contact details for a story you might have for them. But I'm afraid that's all the time we have today. I'd like to round off by saying thank you to all our experts one last time. You can find out more about Nick on his website, nickbarrett.co.uk, and he runs the Styx Research Agency, which you can find out more information about at sra-uk.com. You'll also be able to find Nick on Twitter at FamilyHistorySH. Chris Baker's new book on the Belgian Army is now out with Pen and Sword. You can find that both through Pen and Sword's website or on Amazon. And his websites can be found at thelonglongtrail.co.uk, which has huge amounts of advice for anyone researching their First World War ancestors. But you can also find out about Chris Baker's research services at 1418.co.uk. You can find out more about Jackie on her website at yourfairladies.co.uk. You can keep up with Debbie on her blog at cruise.blogspot.com and find her on Twitter with her Twitter handle of @DebbieKennett. If you'd like to see any more talks from our experts, both from this show and previous events, you can go and watch them on the Family History TV channel. Simply go to family-history.tv to find out more. Thanks once again to all of our experts who have helped us out today, along with our exhibitors, show sponsors and show partners, and of course all of you attending from home. We hope to be able to see you and welcome you to a physical event in 2022. Also keep an eye out for the next online event to be announced. Keep an eye on thefamilyhistoryshow.com. Now, don't forget, all these lectures, as well as this expert panel, are available for 72 hours. So if you want to go back and watch something again, or you think you've missed a talk today, don't worry, you've got the next few days to watch those. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching and enjoy the rest of your day. Cheers.